Hi everyone, trust you all are doing well. So what we're going to be implementing in this lesson is the follow functionality. So I'm logged in as Maya, and if I try to follow John, as you can see, now we get a follow. So now Maya is followed. So if we go to the database, and let's go to the database and just refresh this, you can see that Maya just followed that user. Right, so we're obviously going to implement this functionality. We haven't yet, so I just want to show you how it actually works. Right, so we've got a pivot table right here with, as you can see, Maya Doe is following John Doe right there, and obviously with the timestamps. Right, so that's the kind of functionality we want to implement. So obviously she doesn't have to follow him only. She can go to any user and actually follow them. All right, so in this one, we're just going to implement the functionality. And in the next one, or the coming lessons, whenever the user that the person is following, they need to be able to get a notification, either with a database notification or an email notification. I'm still going to decide which way to notify them, like, listen, this user that you're following created a new thread. All right, so let's do that. Okay, so let's implement this functionality for the person to be able to follow and unfollow a user. Right, so let's get started. Right, so now code editor, the first thing that we're going to do is we need to create a database. So I'm going to create a follows database for the pivot table to be able to track which user is following which user. All right, so let's do that. All right, so let's do that. So PHP artisan make migration. Okay, and this is going to be a create follows table. Right, so now we got our migration all there. So let's go to that. So database migration, you'll see we have our migration right here. Right, so let me just give it some room here. We're going to have two primary keys. Let me just open this. Primary. Right, the first one, we're going to put them in an array, is going to be the user ID. Okay. And the second one, this will be the following user ID. So following user ID. Okay. Now we need two fields in here. We need the, like, basically foreign IDs in order to track which user is where. All right. So let's do that. So the two foreign IDs. The first one, the foreign ID. This one is going to be for the user ID. And this is going to be constrained to the users table and on delete cascade. Okay, and I'm just going to copy this one down, and I'm going to, this one is basically going to be the following user ID, like that. Right, so now we got our database set up. So we got now our follows table right here. Okay, so got a primary, okay, for the user ID. I haven't migrated the database. Let me just show you, because on the finished one, we'll quickly show you. Basically, this is what we have done. We're going to create a user ID and a following user ID. All right. Now, these two keys will basically be the primary keys. All right. And the constraint to users, as you can see, you'll be able to, your SQL database will be able to track where does this user actually go to. That's why the constraint is right there. So it can basically link that ID with the table that you're referencing. So meaning, so that user ID that I'm referencing as my primary ID right there is constrained to the users table. So now my SQL database will basically look at this table and say, okay, that's the ID of 1. It will look in the users table and they will look for the ID of 1. Then it will link. There's basically a link to say, okay, that user ID is linked to that users table right there. Okay, so that's what this is. This is what the foreign ID keys are for. Right. Now that's it. And now the next part is we need to migrate our database. Right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a fresh migration and I'm just going to reseed the database. Okay, that's all done. So let me just close off my terminal. All right, so the next part that I want to do is I need to be able to create a trade for the person to be able to have followers or to follow someone else. All right, so let's quickly create that trade. Go to a new file, and we're going to call this one HasFollows, like this, or you can say HasFollowers, or whatever the case may be, or you can say follow, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to call mine HasFollows.php. All right, so we're just going to create a trade right here. So obviously a PHP tags, and then we're just going to namespace this to app trades right there, and then we're just going to create a trade. All right, and the trade that we're going to call this one is going to be HasFollows, like this. All right, so there's now a couple of methods that we need to create inside here. Okay, so let's do that. So the first one is going to be the relationship, all right, between the user, because one user can follow as many people as they want, and that's the kind of relationship. So basically going to have a belongs to many relationship. All right, so let's do that. So public function, okay, and this one is going to be follow, because I'm thinking what I must name this. Yeah, let's just call it follows. All right, as the previous, because I finished it. So let's just do a belongs to many. All right, just make sure you import that at the top as well. And this is basically going to return this belongs to many. All right. Now the first one is we're going to bring in the user model right there. So bring in the user class. Okay. Then we're going to reference which table. All right. The table is the follows table. You guys remember we created the migration. This one right here, the migration. We created the follows table. We're going to reference this table right there. Okay. Let's make it smaller again. All right. And then we're going to reference basically that user ID. That's the pivot table. Okay. And the other one is the related pivot table, which is going to be the following user ID, like that. Now, next part, I just want to include with timestamps. So whenever something is called upon this relationship and it's updated, we just want to do a timestamp on that relationship as well. All right, so with timestamps. Okay, so let me just do this. Okay. So the following ID right here, I like to explain things, so just bear with me. So we can rather break it up in a couple of lessons than me just rushing through it. Okay. So let me just go to, you see the follows right there is the follows migration that I'm referencing, that table. Okay, the user ID inside that table right there, I'm referencing this user ID. Okay. And then the following user ID, I'm referencing this following user ID right there. Okay, so that's it. Right, so now we got our HasFollows set up right here. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to, let's say we want to check if the user is following that user, because we want to bring in some functionality in there. So we're just going to create a public function. This one is going to be is following. Okay, so we're going to check if that user is following that user. Okay, so we just bring in the user model. Just make sure it's imported right there at the top. Right, so just basically going to return this follows. Okay, this one right here. We're just going to check that relationship. Okay, then we're going to check where following user ID. All right, so we're checking if the user is following. All right, that following user ID is equal to this user ID. Remember, I'm calling on the method inside our user model. So if we open our user model quickly, I'm calling on this method right here. Okay, just in your user model, just remember in the previous ones, we created the username field. All right, in the previous lesson, just make sure that you create a method also referencing the username property like that. Okay. All right, so where the user ID, and then we're just going to check if it exists. This is okay, like that. Right, so we want to check if the user is following. The next part that we want to do is we want to create a means for the user to be able to follow another user. So let's just create that. So follow. Right, so we're just going to create this trait. So follow, got the user right there. Now, basically, we want to return this relationship, basically the follows relationship, and then we want to save the user. All right, like that. Okay, so when we call on this follow, then it's going to call on that relationship, and then we want to save the user as a parameter that we're passing in there. Right, the next one is we want to be able for the user, obviously, to unfollow. So let's just create that quickly. So unfollow. Right, so we pass in the user right there, and then let me just copy that and paste it in here, and that's going to be a detach like that. All right, so basically detach the user from that relationship. Okay. Now the next thing is you didn't need to create a trait. Let me just put it out there. But if we go to our user model, okay, let me just show you. If we go to our user model, you can see there's so much happening in here already because of all the stuff that we're going to add. Now, this is not going to change because if you add something later again, you're going to need to actually fill up this model, obviously, again. But that's why you can create a trait like this, and you can just bring in that trait in your user model. So let's go to the top and quickly add it in here as well. So now we can use as follows. All right, the trait that we just created. So it means all these methods are now available inside our user model right there. Okay. So let me just make sure. Always make sure that you import everything. Otherwise, you're going to run into unnecessary errors. As you can see, all that is done. All is good. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we need to create a route for the person to be able to follow. All right, this way, let me put it like this. In this lesson, what we're going to do is we're just going to make a controller so that there's normal refresh. In the next one, I will update and refactor this to be able to make use of Livewire. But for now, we're just going to make use of a standard Laravel way to do things, okay? So let's open our web route. Let's do that. Okay, so let's open our web route. Right, so now I've got my web route open. You guys remember from the previous one, we created this profile right here. I'm just going to copy this one down. Actually, let me copy the whole thing with the quotes down. Like this, and just change this to follow. Okay. Follows, profile user, and I'm just going to add after this, I'm just going to hit the follow route like that. All right, and this is going to a store method, and I'm just going to call this one follow like that. Okay. Right, so we got our route, we got our profile, we got our username for them to follow, and we have a store method. Right, so let's quickly create a follow controller. So open up your terminal, and then we're just quickly going to create a PHP. Let me just clear this. So PHP artisan I'm going to make a controller. I'm going to put it inside my pages folder, and then I'm get a follow controller like this. All right, so let's go to the controller. All right, inside our controller right here, we're going to create a public function. This is going to be a store method, and then we're going to pass in the user that's going to come in as a parameter. If we go to our web route right here, we're passing in that user right there. So we will receive it as a parameter right here. Okay. So just to check if we get it, so we can just return the user like this, or you can die and dump the user. Okay. To see what user get as a return, but we're going to get to that in a second. All right, so now the other thing that we want to do in this controller is we want to be able to actually toggle if the user followed the user, we want to unfollow. All right, so if they click the button again, if they click it a second time or whatever the case may be, let's say it's unfollowed. Okay, let's go to the browser quickly. I think it's easier if we explain like this. As you can see in this case, if the user is not following this user, so if they click this button, then we need to toggle to say like, listen, all right, this person is following, just unfollow them or follow them. And if they're unfollowed, and if we click the button again to unfollow, it will just basically unfollow that user, right? So that's the functionality we're looking for. All right, so back in our code editor right here, so we're basically going to get the authenticated user, whoever is authenticated. All right, so then we're going to get to the user. All right, and then we're going to create a method inside our trade called toggle follow. I think let's do it. Toggle follow. Then we're just going to pass in the user parameter like this. Okay, and then we're going to return redirect, okay, to a route. And the route will basically be the profile route that we created. Okay, then we're going to pass in there the user name like this. Just remember, I said this username method that we're calling on, if we go to our user model, it's this method right here. Pardon me. So it's this username method right here and just returning that property right there. So let's go back. Right. So this is basically be returning that. So if the user follows, it basically go back to the same place where they were. Right. So we obviously haven't created this toggle follow right here. So let's go to our HasFollows trade and let's quickly create that. Right. So it's just going to create a public function. All right. And we're going to call this one toggle follow. And then obviously we're going to pass in the user parameter right here. Okay. And then we're going to say if this user, is following, okay, so we obviously reference the instance. So if this is following this user, okay, and then what we want to do, then we want to return. So basically, if the user is following, that, like you remember the method. So basically what this will happen, it will check if the user is following. If it is following, then it will basically unfollow the user. Okay, so we're just going to call our unfollow method and we're just going to pass in the user right there. All right. So if it's not, then it's basically going to continue. And then we're basically just going to say return this dot follow. Not follow, just follows. User. Like that. Right, hopefully all of this work, but we haven't gotten to the view yet. So let's go to our web route again. So if we go to that route, so we're just going to have this one route. So if the user click on this route, they will go to this one. Let me just go here. Obviously haven't fixed this yet. So in our route right here, just make sure that you bring in your FollowController right there. Okay, just import that at the top. Just make sure, there it is. It's imported right there. Or you could have just add the full name path to your controller, but for me, this looks just a little bit better. Then you're going to go to your store route, and when we get the authenticated user, then we basically want to toggle that follow, right? So in our Has trades right here, we got that toggle follow method right there. Okay. Now the video is getting a little bit too long, so what I will do, so we got our logic part right here. The next part we want to do is we want to obviously just update the views to be able to be functional, right? So that one will be a shorter lesson. So thank you guys for watching. And if you like the video, guys, please give it a like. If you don't like it, please give it a dislike. I'm not offended by that. So that in order to improve these lessons, and if you have suggestions, as always, please leave them for me in the comment section. And please consider subscribing to the channel. All right. As most of our views are 50-50, 50 from subscribers and 50 from non-subscribers. please consider subscribing. It helps out the channel a lot, and Google will think, hey, this guy's content is worth for people to be shared with, so that they might share these lessons with anyone else. All right. Thank you guys, and see you in the next one. Goodbye. Adios.